Hello, everyone. It's great to see so many people here. My name is Charles Godfray. I'm the director of the Oxford Martin School, and it's with great pleasure that I'm welcoming Lord Layard, Richard Layard, and Jan-Emmanuel de Neve to talk on wellbeing science and policy. I'm going to briefly introduce our two speakers, and then they're going to talk about particularly their new book, which I can thoroughly recommend as an extremely accessible summary of the science of well-being. And then the three of us are going to have a conversation, but we'll make certain that there is plenty of time for questions, and we will finish on time at 1:30. So Lord Layard Richard is a Labour economist. He's based at the London School of Economics, where he's Programme Director of the Centre for Economic Performance, which I believe you co-founded in 1990. Richard has been hugely influential in public policy for many decades, and perhaps most prominently during the Blair-Brown administration. Richard, as a member of the British Academy, has been garlanded with so many awards that I'd take up all the time if I went through them, but I will mention that he was made a life peer in 1990. Jan-Emmanuel is from the home side. Jan works at the Side Business School, grew up in Belgium, went to Harvard University and the LSE, and together with Richard has been involved in a number of initiatives, including the World Happiness Report, and has co-founded the World Wellbeing Movement. And again, is very involved in policy, including with the Belgian government. So with no more ado, Richard, could I ask you to come up?
Thank you. Well, thank you all so much for coming. Very good for our well-being to have you all here, and sold out. Some of our colleagues weren't able to get in, which is a very good thing. I want to start with the first page of our book, which is this. It's one of, I think, 18 illustrations by Mr. Shrigley, who is a leading designer. And of course, it strikes the right note. We do need a new world, a world where people are experiencing higher well-being. And we're only going to get that if we accept that that's the objective. So the first step, I want to make 4 points this morning. But the first one is we have to agree on what is the objective, otherwise we don't get there. So we have to agree that the well-being of the people is the overarching objective. So I like the way Thomas Jefferson put it: the care of human life and happiness is the only legitimate object of good government. A very strong statement, but I can't think why else we would have governments except to try and improve the well-being of the people and the quality of our lives. But there is, of course, one other point going beyond him, which is that we want the happiness to be fairly distributed. So we, modern utilitarians, would want to combine well-being as the overarching objectives with an interest in the distribution and having as few people as possible with lower well-being experiencing misery. So the theory that we're putting forward is that governments have to create the conditions which enable people to be happier, but especially those who would otherwise be in misery. So let's move on to some empirics. Who are the people in misery, and how do we identify what causes the huge spread of well-being in the world? So this brings to the second point, measurement. We can measure well-being, and this has been the revolution of the last 40 years, simply by asking them. So this is a question which most of us favour. Overall, how satisfied are you with your life nowadays? 0 meaning not at all, and 10 meaning very. This is the question that's used in the official Office of the National Statistics survey annually. It's the national statistic of Britain, and it's now recommended by the OECD to all its member countries. It's got many merits. It's simple, easy to understand, much better than what is common practice in some places, have lots of questions and then create an index by applying some weights to do that. This is also more democratic than having researchers applying weights. The person themselves apply the weights to what matters to them and how they feel about it. We know that this question has got strong information content. It's a very good predictor of how long you will live, just about as good as a medical diagnosis. It's a good predictor of whether you will leave your job or your partner. And it's a good predictor, as Jan will be explaining more, about whether you will vote for the incumbent government, which is, of course, why policymakers should take it especially seriously. So let's look at some basic facts which this question reveals about the human condition, which I know the Martin School is focused on. So this is the distribution of well-being in the world. You can see it's extraordinarily unequal, with a fifth at 3 or below and a sixth at 8 or above. And part of that spread, of course, comes from the variation between countries, and part of it comes from the variation within countries. Let me take them in that order. So the top countries tend to be Nordic, they tend to be peaceful, egalitarian, and the bottom ones tend to be those torn by civil conflict or repression. But of course, other factors come in which explain the differences across countries, which include income, but also health, freedom, social support, altruism, trust, all variables where the Nordic countries do well. In fact, in the famous wallet dropping experiment, 80% of the wallets dropped in Nordic countries were returned, compared with half in our country and the US, and under 20% in China. Even though there are these big differences between countries, actually 80% of the variation in happiness in the world is within countries, including our own. So let's move on to what explains the spread within countries. Because if we want to know how to reduce misery, we've got to know what's causing the spread, because that's the same factors as is causing the lower tail. So here's the answer to that. Many causes, and of course income is a very poor proxy, as you will see from the next slide. This slide I'm putting up is a result of estimating an equation across the survey, where you're having to explain the life satisfaction of each individual by as many factors as you can find that explain it. So in this graph, we're going to show for the impact of each variable in terms of its explanatory power to explain life satisfaction and the variation of it, holding each other factor constant. You'll see that the biggest factor is mental health, which is defined as the answer to the question, have you ever been diagnosed for an anxiety disorder or depression? Physical health, perhaps not so well measured, also important. Family life, very important. And employment, of course, and the quality of work, very important, including relationships, and then income. But this is what you get from running a regression of life satisfaction on these variables. But another way of getting at the importance of these variables is, of course, just to ask people what they worry about in their daily life. Remarkably, the answers are almost exactly the same ranking as you see there. So this is such a different picture from what most politicians and most journalists think are the sources are the things that matter to people in their lives. And it's really important that we get a new perspective based on this paradigm. The position of income here helps explain the fact that in many countries, growth has not been accompanied by rising happiness. The USA is the most obvious one for which we have the longest time series, pretty much flat actually, declining a bit toward the end. So there's no time obviously here to discuss the huge volume of research which establishes proper causal estimates of the effect of different factors on well-being. We are all spelled out in our book, and we think that this body of knowledge is now strong enough for the fourth and final proposition. Oh, sorry, I jumped, didn't I? The proposition is that policymakers should judge policies by how much they increase well-being per pound being spent. This is what the OECD and the EU have been asking their member countries to do, and of course it's wonderful that Keir Starmer has made this remark. With every pound spent on your behalf, we'd expect the Treasury to weigh not just its effect on national income, but also its effect on well-being. So stimulated by that, about half a dozen of us at LC are busy trying to show how that can be done. And to those of you who are economists, let me just stress, we're not throwing away traditional cost-benefit analysis. Willingness to pay can still be used where there's enough evidence from revealed preference. But there are many other effects of policy that can't be picked up through revealed preference, and these have to be evaluated using self-reported well-being, and then you can combine the two because you know what is the marginal utility of income. So using this method, we're able to cover huge areas of life where traditional cost-benefit analysis wasn't possible. And these analyses, of course, will then, and do then imply major new priorities. I mentioned mental health, obviously child well-being, youth apprenticeship, I'm very keen on, family conflict, elderly care. These things are as important as the more obvious things for increasing income. So it's really time that we had a broad criterion of well-being to evaluate the whole of public spending. It would be wonderful if the Martin School would take an initiative in doing this, because I think it's sort of perfectly placed to provide a lead in this way of analysing public policy. Jan will be explaining to you why that's also in the interest of the politicians. So I've no doubt that in the years to come, well-being will become the objective of government, at least in this country. And since it's more than 200 years since Jefferson and Bentham advocated this, it's surely time. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, everyone, for the great privilege and the opportunity to present our work and our book to you. I'll build on Richard and highlight a few of the insights that we develop in the book. I'll start with building on the important point that Richard just made. Besides, arguably, a moral imperative to put well-being much closer to the heart of policymaking, we also now have evidence that it's not just the right thing to do, but probably also the politically astute thing to do. And advances here are made by our former student, now dear colleague, George Ward, who in a very important paper, in our view, in the American Journal of Political Science, now 4 years ago, published this work where he trailed through all of the European elections and looked at variation in incumbent vote shares and linked that to variation in both life satisfaction, the measure that Richard has introduced to you, as well as, and compare this to the traditional classic economic voting time variables, which are obviously GDP growth rates, employment or / unemployment, and inflation. What George found, and why I think this is such an important piece of work, is that well-being, subjective well-being, well-being as people rate the quality of their lives themselves, is a better predictor of incumbent vote share than any of the other more economic items are. The more you let that sink in, and I do advise you to read that paper, you'll see it's actually quite intuitive, because voting is, while you're taking in the objective world around you, you do so through a subjective lens. And for that reason, I think our subjective well-being measures actually come quite close to that truth as people experience it. But besides being the politically astute thing to do, it's also probably the politically necessary thing to do in certain situations. What you're seeing here is an analysis we did for the book, which is the March 15th, 2019 Hong Kong protests were high on the political agenda or the media agenda. So we looked at GDP as a predictor of potential unrest, and then compared that with how that might be different when you look at well-being as a predictor of social unrest in these cases. And what you'll see is Hong Kong, if you had just looked at the economic data, in this case GDP per capita, what an extraordinary good news story this was. In the space of just shy of a decade, they've increased their GDP per capita by about 50%. If, however, you look at how people actually feel in Hong Kong, and in particularly in this case youth, and the younger generation, you would have seen that there was a significant drop in how people rated the quality of life as they experience it. This also mirrors other analyses of this kind that look at the run-up to the Arab Spring, where we've got the inspiration for this analysis. But it shows you that there's something very powerful that subjective well-being and well-being metrics bring to the table that traditional GDP indicators do not. All right, let me turn to the world of work, which has been mostly my focus of research. And Richard already highlighted the fact that workplaces are an important driver of global general well-being. But just how important is it really? And here too, well-being science has made a lot of advances, and I think can really add into labor economics and thinking more broadly about the importance of work. We all know work is important, and it's because of both the paycheck the income it provides, but beyond that, the non-pecuniary elements to do with social status, identity, social networks, routine throughout the day, and so much more. What we're showing here is what it does to one's well-being if all of this is taken away. So what you're seeing here is a cohort study where you see people before being made redundant and following being made redundant. Obviously, the word making redundant should probably be reframed, and it's not a word. It's obviously the word that you shouldn't be using in these instances, but it is obviously describing what happens. What you're seeing here is a drop, if you put gender together, of about 1 point on a scale from 0 to 10 when people are being made redundant. That is a lot, especially because typically people, average populations are 6, 6.5, 7 in the case of the UK. So losing a whole point, in the case of males even more, you'll find that there's close to a 20% drop in well-being and quality of life as you experience it. That is huge. And it's obviously one of the key insights, and probably one of the most robust insights that have come out of well-being science and have really added to labor economics, I think. There is a small difference between men and women, but I think the main insight coming through following the importance of work for well-being is also the fact that people don't adapt to unemployment. So typically in well-being science, we found that whenever a shock to life happens, whether a positive or a negative, people tend to adapt to it relatively quickly, even things that you wouldn't expect people to adapt to, but not so for losing their job. And again, I think mostly for the non-pecuniary reasons just highlighted. In labor economics, this now has a term has been coined for this, which is the scarring effect of unemployment. This type of science, these type of results, I think put even more pressure on policymakers, especially on the economics front, to try and do as well as they can to try and maintain people in work and do a good job for them, both the quantity and quality of jobs. All right, that is work for the importance of work for well-being. But can we turn this around? How important is how we feel at work for the quality of our work, our individual performance, if you will, and possibly even organizational performance? So that's what we spent quite a bit of time working on in recent years. And I'm very pleased to share with you a paper that was published last year in Management Science that took us about 7-8 years to produce. And I think it produces the first causal field evidence for the link between how we feel as individuals and how that translates into our performance, literally in this case from 1 week to another. We studied BT call center employees 1 week to another, pulsing how they felt from 1 week to another every Thursday at 4 p.m. to be more precise. and then link that to incredibly granular performance data. Weekly sales, customer satisfaction, number of seconds on a call, how many calls, you name it. What you're seeing here is the main sort of, we can talk about this for an hour, but what you're seeing here is the headline result, which is essentially if you feel much better than you did the previous week, we find up to about 12, 13% increases in weekly sales. It's very tangible. Now, interestingly, and this is just a side note, but it also depends on the kinds of tasks you're doing, the importance of how you feel. So what this is just an average effect. When people were asked to deal with, say, disgruntled customers and retaining their business, the importance of how they felt from one week to another was way more important than this. On the other hand, admittedly, when it was just order taking, where no social and emotional intelligence was required, there was little or no effect of how you felt. So it goes to show for anybody working on workplace well-being and is involved with workplaces more generally, the degree to which you're applying social and emotional intelligence is very much, and the success of that is very much driven by how you feel yourself in the first place. And we picked this up in a way that's never been shown before. Now, this is at the individual level, and this starts hinting at the fact that if there's such strong, powerful links at the individual level between how we feel and the quality of our work, does that feed into larger organizations? This is one channel by way this might go. There's other channels. A good workplace where people feel good are probably going to be attracting more talent because people have word of mouth and other places to find out whether it's a good workplace. A good workplace where people feel good is probably going to retain their talent for longer as well. And so all these channels and pathways, can we then show whether there's also a link at the organizational level? And I'm very pleased to say in the last 2 years, we've done a lot of work on that. What you're seeing here is the results of the world's largest study on workplace well-being, where in this case, we've got more than 1,600 US listed firms where we have both solid well-being data crowdsourced, thanks to platforms like Glassdoor and Indeed, linked to the quarterly data that these companies need to provide in a systematic, comparable way. What you're seeing here is bins with the top 10%, the bottom 10%, and everything in between. And what you're seeing is the average company well-being coming back to us from the employees themselves through our crowdsourced measures is very strongly associated with the key financial performance metrics, whether it's gross profitability, return on assets, or firm value. This is obviously just contemporaneous. This is associations or correlation, but there's definitely something very powerful between how we feel at work as an organization and how that translates into organizational performance. Can we go a step further and see whether there's sort of a predictive power? One way of doing that is to look at stock markets. What you're seeing here is an analysis that got a lot of attention in the media and is something very basic. It's called a portfolio analysis. Anybody investing in stocks, you'll be familiar with this. Think of this as follows. Say you've got $1,000 to invest. Most of you might do this in an index fund, such as the S&P 500. And what you would have been given back of your $1,000 over the last few years, since we have the data, would have been something somewhat positive, despite a lot of volatility. So what you're seeing here is 2021, 2022, and the start of 2023, with the traditional benchmark indices going up, going down, and then volatility in 2023 so far. What we've done is, we've looked at the extraordinary data we've got on how people feel in these listed companies, put them in an index, taking the top 100, you can take the top 200 or top 50, whatever you want, and then see whether that outperforms on the stock market. What you're seeing here now is something really rather extraordinary. It shows that the stock market doesn't fully value the intangibles of how people feel, in part because they don't necessarily have access to the data on this. But even if they did, they seem to underestimate the importance of how workers feel and how that over time feeds into the bottom line. Just a reminder, what we've done here is the 2020 data on workplace well-being, put that in index and let that run starting January 1st, 2021. And then do the same thing again at the start of 22 and the same again at the start of 23. A portfolio based just on quality workplaces would have outperformed all the major indices. Now, if this doesn't convince you or a little interest, hopefully the stuff that Richard shared with you is of interest, and if failing that, we'd suggest that you still have a look at the book, because there's extraordinary illustrations by David Strigley in there, and that are really pique one's thinking. So I'll leave it at that, put the main screen back on, and thank you very much for your time and attention.
I'm actually going to ask for the main screen to be turned off so we're not blinded. Thanks, that was really fascinating. So I'm going to start with a question. There will be an election this year. We're non-party political at the Martin School, so we don't know if it's going to be Starmer or Sunak or Farage. But if you got the phone call a few days after the election, we have no money. What can we do that would make a difference to people's lives that we could do relatively fast? Perhaps I'll ask both of you that. Richard.
Well, I've got actually three things. First, I want this policy oriented to well-being, and I want to change altogether what goes on in Whitehall, so that's how people think about policy priorities for any government. But my next thing, as you say, there's no money. I've got some policies which don't actually save more money than they cost. So I was involved in developing what's now called NHS talking therapies for anxiety disorders and depression. And we've been able to show that saves more money in terms of getting people off disability benefits into work, paying taxes, also saving NHS money on physical health care, far in excess of the original cost. I want now a parallel service for addiction and personality disorders which are causing havoc in our society and in our families. More difficult to treat, but on the hand, the savings will be even greater. So that's my second thing. My third thing is I think it's an absolute disgrace in this country how we treat people after they leave school if they don't go to university. We have no proper system of vocational training and apprenticeship, which is as easy to access as the university is if you go down the academic route. It's a disgrace. I want a guaranteed access to apprenticeship.
Great. Jan.
I'll add something in the sense that the science does show that mental health, workplaces, all the items, the policy items that Richard has just highlighted are incredibly important. I think there's a third one, and I'll actually paraphrase something that Richard is known for, the social infrastructure. So you've got the actual infrastructure. Politicians are always very keen to invest in roads, HS2, trains, what have you, and that needs to be done, but not at the expense or by overlooking social infrastructure. Social capital, social trust, things that we've lost in many cases, turn out to be a lot more important than people think at different levels of life. But for example, in our World Happiness Report, when you look at what explains variation between countries, then a lot of things play a role, including income, of course. But the one that stands out as the strongest tends to be social support, social capital, volunteering opportunities, trust in each other, trust in institutions. So I think there's a lot more work there to be done, and it tends to be overlooked because it doesn't necessarily feed into GDP.
So let me ask you a couple of questions about people who have sort of challenged the well-being approach. And you mentioned that you describe yourself as a new utilitarian. And utilitarianism has had a mixed ride over the last century. And there are many schools of thought associated with rights, associated with capabilities and things, who I suspect would be very happy with many of your micro-analyses, but would be worried about an overarching utilitarian framework, worrying that it will affect the rights of disadvantaged. And I know you address some of this in the book, and I wonder if you might just elaborate a little bit more what you mean by being a modern utilitarian.
Well, Jeremy Bentham suggested that the objective should be simply the sum of happiness, or the average of happiness in the population. I think most modern people with this type of approach, but I have to exclude Peter Singer, who's a very distinguished utilitarian at Princeton, but apart from him, I think most people feel that it must be more important to enable somebody starting low to move up by 1 unit of happiness than to do the same for somebody starting high. So this I think leads to, the way we would, within this framework, express the idea of social justice. The idea of social justice is that priority is to be given to people who are starting low. But then we need, of course, this much wider concept of starting low than simply income. Maybe you want to come at that later, but that's my concept of utilitarianism applied in a way that's sensitive to the distribution of well-being as well as its average.
But I guess the advantage of economic utilitarianism is you have a metric there, money, which is sort of, you don't argue with. But taking this more sophisticated approach, how do you actually define the function that allows you to weight the interests of people with different backgrounds or different stages?
No, this of course is a problem because the views people have on this differ, and it's a normative and ethical question. And we're talking about, how can academics help policymakers to achieve what they value? I mean, you can write down, of course, a mathematical value with a sort of parameter which values as to how egalitarian a policymaker is. But another way, obviously, more sort of straightforward way to policymakers who are not mathematically minded, is to print out what is the impact of your policy on people who are starting at different levels of well-being, and look at different policies and let policymakers make their choice using their own judgment.
Thanks very much. Jan, could I ask you a question? So there has been some criticism from the left of the approach. People from the left are often very happy about shifting from finance to thinking about well-being, but then worry about some of the analysis might underestimate the role of income and income distribution. So some of the things that you put up there that were correlated with happiness might actually mask the underlying effect of income and distribution. And I have heard people say, well, a problem with well-being, it may mask some of the entrenched power relationships in the economy that sort of maintain the status quo.
It's a difficult question. I think first and foremost, I'm a bit, would be surprised by that criticism coming from the left, because in a way, well-being science, and the main result has really been diminishing marginal utility of income itself, if you look at it from an economics perspective, really suits a center-left agenda on progressive taxes and redistribution, because what we found very clearly is somebody making $1 million, the extra 10,000 will mean less in terms of subjective well-being than somebody making 10,000 getting an additional 10,000. That's been pretty well established. And so it gives you a whole new angle or perspective or justification for progressive taxation that is not typically used. So I think that helps that part of the agenda. Now there's also, the well-being agenda can also help on the conservative side. And so, which is why it's so, I think, exciting, because it's something, an agenda that left and right and center can find themselves in. Yes, of course, GDP or income could sit behind some of the elements. For example, if education has a positive impact on well-being, it may well be because of the socioeconomic status and the power and wealth that sits behind some of that. But that in the science, when you dig into the book, you'll see we do try and look for causal inference, which would take out these omitted variables that might be hiding in the shadows. So income matters. I don't think anybody should be naive about that, but there are diminishing marginal utility. And for me, as sort of somebody with in economics, it always blows my mind that one of the first things you learn is diminishing marginal utility of hamburgers, of Coca-Cola, of anything you consume, but it's very rarely applied in Economics 101 to income itself. And we find that so clearly. And so I think that is probably a big insight coming through for the left.
Thank you. Richard, I'm a biologist, so clearly Aristotle is a hero of mine.
Yeah.
And I felt at the beginning of the book that you were a bit down on Aristotle and his ideas of eudaimonia and a virtuous life. But then, am I right, you sort of came back a bit later on when you talked about the importance of not just the sum of individual well-being, but societal well-being as well. And is there a role for sort of thinking about what makes a virtuous life in not only increasing your own happiness, but the happiness of society more broadly?
What you just said at the end, of course, is true. But the question is, what is the objective? And the great thing about Aristotle, of course, was that he had this idea that there must be, if you were to have some coherent way of thinking about what you're trying to do, you can only have one objective which you use to compare the value of different courses of action. So, I mean, the telos, this is the great idea in Aristotle. And the problem with Aristotle is that he then defined as the objective something which was a mixture of good experience and virtue, whereas this doesn't quite resolve the issue. We would think of virtue as a means to the end of a society in which people are enjoying their lives. But obviously, a society in which people are enjoying their lives won't exist if people are each only concerned with promoting their own well-being. So a means to a society in which people are enjoying their lives is that people devote a lot of their energy to improving the well-being of other people. So virtue is a means to the end. It also, of course, is to some extent has rewarding effects on the person, the virtuous person. But virtue is mainly to be advocated because it produces a good overall outcome for everybody.
If I may comment on that, I think that the key here is what Richard just said at the end. Virtue is its own reward to some extent. That, and there's now wonderful proof of this, work done with NHS volunteers showing that obviously it helps people they're helping, but it also helps them to some extent. So if we do put well-being as the ultimate criterion to inform policy, then that sort of encapsulates virtuous behaviors as well. So if I were to clone myself right now and I do something nice for another person and my clone does something bad for another individual, the version of me that has done something good pro-socially should feel better, should have higher life satisfaction. And so that, I think, is something that will help provide weight behind having a measure like life satisfaction at the very top, because it incorporates virtuous behaviors to some extent. Maybe not fully, but to some extent.
Jan, might I ask you a question about well-being over time? And you showed that astonishing results about how well-being now can affect voting preferences. And that, if I was a politician, then that would really reinforce you need a budget giveaway just before an election. So presumably what you want is a measure of well-being that sort of takes into account the trade-offs of doing that to the future. And then in the book you talk about climate change as well, which is the sort of mother of all trade-offs in the future. And you argue that with well-being, then you take a similar approach to economics, but your discounting value is lower, so you value the future more. I guess I have two questions. So if you look at the economic literature, it's slightly scary how much the policy implications depend on assumptions about discount rates, sort of Nordhaus versus Stern, for example. So how do you, the problem is the future is so big that sort of basis points change in discount rates make a huge difference. How do you get around some of those problems?
I'll say. I mean, the basic concept of the discount rate, which is used by economists, say by the Treasury, is there's an element of what you call pure time preference connected with uncertainty. They have 1.5%. And then there's the assumption that as people will become richer with economic growth, their marginal utility of income will be lower, so it's not so important to give them the higher income. That the Treasury have at 2%, so that gives you 3.5%, which I think means that in the year 2100, a pound then is worth to us today 6 pence. So you can forget the end of the century. And this is what the the economists who were against the climate change movement relied on. What was hopeless about it, in a sense, was thinking about the whole thing in terms of income, because income is not the only thing that matters to people. If their whole society is turned upside down and they're on the move and they've all kinds of, and other people are being disrupted by their arrival, etc., etc. If you think in terms of well-being, then you are left only with the 1.5%, which gives you a much more serious approach to future generations. I mean, when we talk about whose well-being matters, I think we would like to say that well-being of future generations matters as much as our own. But then you get into a logical problem because everything is valued at infinity. So you've got to have an element of discounting, but it shouldn't certainly be too high.
Yeah, but it does make a big difference, exactly.
It does, yeah.
What you used.
Yeah, no, Richard put it beautifully, but it shows that if you take well-being seriously and put it at the heart of policy making, it also helps you deal with climate change, the environmental challenges, because as Richard said, you don't want to discount the well-being of future generations by nowhere near as much as the economics approaches would. Because Richard is quite right, in traditional economic approaches currently baked into English, the UK government's cost-benefit analysis is 3.5–4%. So that means in what is it, 75 from now, we don't look very much beyond 2,100 in that case. Whereas we would, of course, when we think about future generations and their well-being.
So I'm about to go to the audience, but I have one last question, which is partly facetious but partly serious. So I plan this evening to open a nice bottle of red wine, and I suspect my well-being will sort of incrementally go up. Is that a virtuous thing to do? And the serious question is the criticism, you bring it up in the book, the famous Aldous Huxley, Brave New World, Soma. Were we to come up with a drug that increased our subjective well-being, and it tends to go against sort of an Aristotelian virtuous life, that one does it by cheating. How do you confront the sort of Aldous Huxley Soma question?
Well, I think, I mean, the first thing that I would say is what would happen, actually, if somebody invented a drug which made you feel good, better than you otherwise would, with no side effects. I mean, why wouldn't we all take it? I mean, I just can't see anything wrong in that. I mean, we organise our lives in all kinds of ways so as to make our lives enjoyable. But we eat different foods. What's wrong with including a pill? I mean, I just don't see that at all. I think he was absolutely barking up the wrong tree there.
I guess the key is if there are no trade-offs, and so for something that felt wonderful, there still may be trade-offs if you didn't go to work or.
And I think your bottle of red wine is a perfect example for that. In moderation, it might help, but in too much, it will have a negative spillover effect on the next day.
I have some experimental data to support that. Let me go to the audience. Just to remind everyone, we are being recorded, so just beware that will happen. Would someone like to put up their hands? And if you could, in the front here, Clara, and if you can just wait for the microphone to come.
My hearing is not that great.
I'll just check. It's fine. I'm a great fan of everything you're doing. I work in the field of emotional intelligence, but I've got 2 points which I care to hear your comments. We're talking about science and policy. In order to create policy, you need to have a criterion to judge against. You mentioned ultimate criterion. And in all the graphs and things I've seen, happiness, life satisfaction, and well-being seem to have been interchanged. In fact, one had life satisfaction across the bottom and happiness, that was a US one along the bottom. Others had well-being everywhere, and I feel that it's not particularly helpful unless you're going to define each one, because they seem to be interchangeable. Now, with the new data that exists, I was part of the 2007...
Forgive me, we have lots of questions.
Okay,
so if you
happiness conference, and we've got much more data now. So that's my first thing that we need to be clear about
Okay,
well-being.
I'm going to stop you there.
Yeah.
So
Well, this book is mainly about life satisfaction, which is the concept used in the World Happiness Report and the most used and most researched definition. And that, as you know, is what people call evaluative well-being. It involves an element of judgment about how you feel about your life. Language is difficult here, but how you feel about your life is not quite the same as how you feel at the moment. That's what's called hedonic, as you know. And I mean, to measure how people feel over the integral of time, that's obviously a massive research task for a start. There are a lot of problems, I think, in having that as your ultimate maximum. For example, do you include dreams? I mean, all kinds of issues to do with consciousness and so on. So I think we're at the early stages in this subject. You know, it's been going in this form for at most 40 years. And I think for the moment, particularly in the realm of policy, policymakers are very used now to asking people, how satisfied are you with your police service or your transport system? Why not? Let's just jack it up to how satisfied are you with your whole life?
Thank you. I know there's lots of expertise in the room, but please could you keep your questions so we hear from the speakers there? And then I'll go to one from online afterwards.
I'll keep it short and sharp. I'm ex-military. I advise in cyber intelligence, and I'm also a mentor for a military charity. In my career, I have seen horrors, and certainly in cybersecurity, there are some pretty awful things happening to people. And in such a short period, you've really got me thinking, because security is so important to people's lives, but to me, and I'm probably wrong, it appears that a lack of security is negative. Look at Gaza, Ukraine. But positive security is neutral. And I just wonder if there is evidence that well-being can be experienced by people who simply are living secure lives.
That is a tough question. I think you're quite right. Sometimes we get the criticism, say in the World Happiness Report, that in some countries it doesn't move much until there's a war, of course, and then boom, way down. And so you'll see in the World Happiness Report that we're preparing now, we actually dig into the Israel, the Gaza, Ukraine data a bit more, as we already did Ukraine last year as well. So you see huge drops in case of insecurity, when it certainly really hits home. Afghanistan, actually, before what happened 2-3 years ago, was bad. Now it's at the very bottom. Sit tight for a second. The average reported life satisfaction in Afghanistan is not even 2 out of 10. That's the average. That means that if one person has 5, that means you need another 10 to put in 0. So insecurity is hugely damaging. But I think you're quite right. Once there's sort of a secure base, then people, Richard's going to hate me for saying this, but so Maslow's pyramid of needs, then they start thinking possibly about other things. But there's questions about Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
I'm going to ask a question
but could I just, you mentioned Maslow. Your question about security is a good one, because think of all the dimensions of security. I mean, there's food security, there's security from violence, there's security from imprisonment, there's security in your family relationship. Is your wife going to betray you? The security for are your children doing all right? So I think it's there's even inner security. Do you feel your place in the universe is okay? So I just want to say that there is no evidence nor was any produced by Maslow in favour of the Maslow hierarchy. All the good research done by Ed Dino, who's the founder of this subject, showed that these effects are additive. But of course, all the dimensions of security matter.
Thank you for that question. Stephanie Cahill online asks, what are your thoughts regarding child and adolescent well-being? Do children with low well-being become adults with low well-being? Should we be looking at that more closely and investing there? And you do deal with this in your book, but perhaps you might... Jan, do you want...
Richard, do you mind if I... there's two answers. The first one is, and this is really should be Richard answering, is he's got an amazing book, came out with Princeton University Press a few years ago, called Wellbeing Over the Life Course, which, for whomever the person is online, check it out, because that's precisely it. That they're digging into the best data sets that have looked at kids and their mothers, even before birth, and those relationships and the importance of well-being at those very, very early stages, and how predictive and how important that is as you go through life. So it's a brilliant piece of work. Now, I do want to get excited about this question because we're working on it right now with the team at the Wellbeing Research Center for the next World Happiness Report. We are publishing, and the biggest piece of research trying to tie in all the data sets worldwide around child and adolescent well-being. Because truth be told, our World Happiness Report that people tend to refer to is based off the Gallup World Poll, these rankings, which is technically 18 plus. And so for this year's World Happiness Report will come out on March 20th. The aim is precisely to start slice and dice this a bit more between sort of generations and drag in the PISA data, which is 15-year-olds, and data from elsewhere, children's worlds with 11, 12-year-old data from not the entire world, but lots of places, including some of the global south. What we're seeing there, I can't yet reveal because it's under embargo, but it's something's aligned with intuition, which is not pretty, as we all know, but some things are also so semi-surprising. And so there needs to be a lot more focus on child and adolescent well-being, not just because there's little data, we need more focus, no, also because the data isn't looking pretty, especially in the Western world. It's coming down and it's really falling off a cliff.
Thank you. I'm going to go to the back now for, is there a question?
But in that study of the life course, I mean, the most important single finding in that book is that if you take a child at 16 and you want to predict whether they will be a happy adult, their exam scores, even right up to their PhD, are a worse predictor of whether they'll be a happy adult than just performance on a single test score, questionnaire test of emotional health. So, yeah, emotional health is in childhood is number one for a satisfying life.
I think I can spot Lucy
If only,
at the back
if only
there.
with someone here from the Department of Education.
Lucy.
I'm short, so I'm standing. Thank you, that was really fascinating. I was curious when you put out an early slide, showed differences between Scandinavia and Central African Republic. And I was just wondering, what is the discourse? How far has the discourse on well-being gone in the kind of lowest income countries in the global south?
Did you get that, Richard?
No.
So Lucy asked how much of these concepts talked about in low-income countries, the poorest countries in the world?
It's a very good question. I'm not sure I can answer it correctly. The countries which I'm aware of, where it's talked about a lot, are China. India, disappointingly, there seems to be, we've hardly located anybody talking about it. Although in some sense you would think it was a fundamental Hindu concept, but it hasn't generated a sort of modern type of debate. But I mean, we have studied it, of course, in the Gallup World Poll. It's every country, and what's remarkable is that the well-being equation is very similar in developing countries. The effect of log income on happiness is pretty much the same in rich and poor countries. So there's the same issue in developing countries as in our country, that there are so many other factors as well as income which are important. And I think, for example, the awful neglect of mental health in developing countries, absolutely shocking, and development specialists from the West, I think, have done very little to point out that mental health is an incredibly important thing, however rich or however poor you are.
A related question to that, Nisreen Alwan on the line, and this is a slightly more technical one. How good is the data from the bottom 5 countries when you were making those comparisons? Because it must be very hard to collect.
We owe a lot to Gallup here, and
Yep.
they go out of their way to try and have a comparable approach to collecting a representative sample of countries. And they even go into places of conflict, from Sudan, Central African Republic, Gaza, Ukraine. And so we do trust them, and we see sort of the internal and the external validity of these numbers seem reliable. Now, there are obviously questions about when you start comparing countries, language differences, psychosocial or cultural differences, what is the specific item, how does it get translated, how does it interpret it? So there are differences, but I think in a way, the big differences you see between, say, Central African Republic, as was raised, and the Scandinavian countries, that in and of itself gives you, when you see these drops in Afghanistan or in these war-torn countries, that speaks for the data from a very gut instinctive level, I think, when you see these drops.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, I'm afraid. Clara, I'll let you choose.
Thank you. And thank you for the walk from the station. Alex Murdoch here, I'm a retired professor. Particularly around Scandinavia, where I've lived, one of the things that I note with Scandinavia is a general sense of equality. You know, people do not put a high value in possessions and cars as much as in other countries. And I just wondered whether that's a factor in all the countries in your scale being at the top there, the so-called... There's something in Scandinavia you may have heard of called Jante law, which is saying you're no better than anyone else, you know, and possessions is not regarded as particularly impressive. What would you feel about that in terms of Scandinavian countries?
One of the fundamental problems of the human psyche is the tendency to compare yourself with other people. So, especially in the United States, this has been elevated through almost into a norm that you ought to compare yourself with other people. Your job in life is to do better than other people. Now, you can see straight away that that's a zero-sum game. However hard you try, for every winner there's a loser. You can't have a happier society if your aim is to do better than other people. So if you have a society which you have somewhat more in Scandinavia than in the rest of the advanced world, where you're not meant to be trying to show how different you are from other people, you're meant to try and exploit the things you have in common with other people, that's going to be a happier society.
Right, we have to come to an end here. I'm not going to treat it as a question, but as a comment, but I think it's very interesting. Michelle Wilson online, given the observed effect of redundancy or data, are there any parallels, and I would add lessons, for fixed-term contracts and precarity in higher education? I think that's a message for the university. I suspect we could have gone on till it would be time to open a bottle of red wine later on. It's always a mark of an excellent seminar when there are more questions. Just before thanking the speakers, I mentioned 2 talks that we're coming up later in February, and do have a look on our website. One on a not completely dissimilar topic is from the Labour politician Liam Byrne, who has a book out on the ills of inequality, and he'll be talking about that. And then I think it's the same week we have Patrick Vallance, who you'll all know from his high exposure during the pandemic, and talking about not actually COVID, but talking about broader issues of science and government. Many thanks for coming. It's been a great audience, but will you join me in giving a large round of applause to Richard and Jan for a super.